Hi everyone, Liane here. I hope you're doing well. Today I am featuring Teranishi Opera Rose, which is one of my favorite all-time inks. And I've gathered other inks in my collection that I think look very similar to it. And we'll do some writing samples and also provide some close-ups and first impressions at the very end. As you see here, I am showcasing some of the supplies that I'm using for today's swatching. And I do want to give you a heads up that these close-ups are really blurry, but these are just a lineup of the inks that I'm going to sample in this video. And I wanted to mention that the ink bottle on the right is Lennon Toolbar Wolfberry, and it's not going to be featured. I'm actually going to feature Colorverse Kyujang-gak, and I haven't forgotten Colorverse Brunch Date. I do have an image of the completed ink swatch at the very end of the video that I'll provide in the close-up section. Okay, so this first ink is Teranishi Opera Rose, and it is the very ink that I have been inspired to build this entire video around. And what I love about this ink is that it is vintage inspired. It's less saturated ink that provides this beautiful muted romantic vibe. It is not completely pink, not completely brown, it's not completely orange. It's hanging in the very central balance of all three inks. And I first found out about this ink from Abby C, I believe, and she had talked about it in one of her videos. And I scoured the internet, found it on the St. Louis art supply website, and promptly bought it. And I think if there is any ink that I have been touting, it has been Teranishi Opera Rose. This next ink is Brown Colibri by Octopus Inks. I found this on the Van Ness website, and it is a beautiful, well-behaved, well-lubricated ink that is waterproof, and I believe it's also pigment-based. You can tell it's a little bit more orange-leaning than pink and red, but I think it's a really comparable ink. And what I think is so lovely about this ink is the subtle satin finish that you'll see at the end of the video when I provide a close-up. Now I've got Sailor Ink Studio number 573, and this is one of my favorite inks from the Sailor Ink Studio line. As you'll see shortly, this ink is very similar to Octopus Ink's Brown Colibri. It's more orange leaning. However, I would also say that as the writing sample and the ink swatch dries, it takes on qualities very similar to both Opera Rose and Brown Colibri, where it picks up a little bit of the rosy pink and also maintains some of that orangey color as well from Brown Colibri. I would also consider this ink, like Teranishi Opera Rose and Brown Colibri, to be more of a wet ink. I don't consider it to be dry at all. Now this ink really surprised me because I didn't realize how similar this ink would be to Teranishi Opera Rose. Kyujang-gak by Colorverse is this gorgeous muted red that when you look at this wet ink swatch, it takes on a beautiful rosy pink color. And I just didn't realize that it would look so much like Opera Rose, because I thought Opera Rose had a little bit of orange depending on the paper and the lighting, a little bit of orange, a little bit of brown, a little bit of rosy pink. I thought that Kyujang-gak would be purely red and pink, which it is. However, I just didn't realize that they would look almost near identical. In the ink swatch, the circular ink swatch, you can see a slight difference in their color, but particularly in the writing samples, as you'll see later on in the video, they look very similar. J. Herbin's Rusty Anchor Red is a gorgeous color. As you can see from the circular ink swatch, it is probably like a less saturated, a lighter version of Teranishi Opera Rose. I did have some trouble with the writing sample, and as I looked online, it seemed as though this is a drier ink, and so the flow was difficult. I had to dip it in the ink a few times, the dip pen that is, to get some sort of flow, and it was still difficult. So I don't think this ink is particularly compatible with dip pens. And if you do want to ink it up in a fountain pen, I would recommend that you ink it in a really wet pen, a wet nib, or in like a medium or broad nib. But this ink is still really beautiful nonetheless. A little too light for my preference, but I think it's still a beautiful color. Kobe number 54 in Goshikiyama Ochre looks very, very similar to Herbin's Rusty Anchor Red. And as I just lifted that cup, you could see how similar the two are. And I believe that this ink is also on the drier end, particularly because I had the same flow issues when I would dip my Kakimori glass dip pen into the ink. It just means that I would just say that these two inks, Herbin's Rusty Anchor Red and Goshikiyama Ochre, are not quite so compatible with dip pens, but you tell me. You can leave it in the comments what your experience has been as you've been testing these inks with your own dip pens. I would suggest that you would ink up this particular ink with your wetter, juicier nibs, as it's a drier and a lighter ink. Platinum Brun Sepia is a waterproof pigment-based ink that is very well lubricated, is very well behaved. And actually this is a sample vial that I got from Lorelei, and I enjoyed it so much that I ended up buying a bottle for myself. And as you can see in the wet sample or in the wet swatch, it definitely leans a little bit pink, but as the ink swatch dries, it'll take on more of its brown ink qualities or brown color qualities. So if you're looking for a really cozy, muted brown, then I really recommend Platinum Brun Sepia. It's one of my favorite inks. This is Kobe number 8 in Arima Amber. And now in hindsight, I'm thinking this is probably an ink that I shouldn't have had in today's selection. In fact, I should have had Colorverse Brunch Date in here, but I think in just my haste, I somehow left it out. So I do have a close-up of Colorverse Brunch Date at the end of this video, but I just want to let you know that just looking on screen here, Arima Amber, I would say, is probably the one that looks the least like Opera Rose as far as these ink swatches go. However, I mean, now that it's on here, it is a nice color comparison. It's a little bit more orange leaning, a little bit more on the brick red side. And I would say that it's probably a little bit darker in comparison to Sailor Ink Studio 573. Now, as I show a close-up of all of the inks, I just wanted to point out that Octopus Ink's Brown Colibri has a beautiful satin finish, and I think it's just a beautiful color on its own. But as you can see, Teranishi Opera Rose, Herbin's Rusty Anchor Red, Goshikiyama Ochre, and very surprised by Colorverse Kyujang-gak. I would say those 4 colors look most similar to one another. And those that lean a little bit more orange and brown would be Platinum Brun Sepia, Arima Amber, Brown Colibri, and also Sailor Ink Studio 573. Now this is a close-up of a previous ink swatch that I had done, and you can see Colorverse Brunch Date on the top left and Teranishi Opera Rose on the far right. So let me know in the comments what your favorites were, if you even have Teranishi Opera Rose, and if you don't, I'm curious to know which inks that you are leaning towards. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!